Yes, thank you. Hopefully this is working. My name is Seth Barnes, and I'm with the Oregon Forest Industries Council. Chair Scar, Vice Chair Magruder, members of the council, thanks for the opportunity to provide a little bit of comment. As I said, my name is Seth Barnes with OFIC. I'm the Director of Forest Policy at Oregon Forest Industries Council. I'm here today to offer comment on the agenda items before you. And first, I want to preface this with an obvious sort of situational awareness of where we're at. As far as I'm aware, every state agency in Oregon has been asked to produce a budget reduction or a cuts list. And that's likely just the beginning, right? As you guys know, budgets are not good. As you're all too aware, there's been no solution also brought forward to make the counties whole in light of the HCP adoption either. And to make matters worse, ODF shared with the SFAC last week that it's been that they are working on deferring projects, cutting, reducing young stand management treatments, and basically trying to figure out how to deal with less and plug holes so the ship doesn't sink as quickly in terms of the program. With that, they're also running the FDF fund down negatively towards zero. So it is within this very real context that we gather here today to talk about the management plan and trying to manage what's left of the state forest following the HCP adoption. This plan will be the plan that's pitched, as far as I'm aware, and looking at the materials, looks like it's going to call for about 215 million board feet, plus or minus, of harvest per year. And so here's a few notes to think about as you get into your discussion. This recommendation of 250 million board feet includes common school fund lands and Board of Forestry lands. The counties received no revenue from the common school fund lands. I don't believe you do. So excluding those from the equation leaves the county cut right around 205 plus or minus million board feet. And for the record, I would just like to remind the committee that this is a state forest that produces, on average, over, and it's, I believe, well over. It's been, documented at different times in different places with different numbers. But nevertheless, I believe it's well over 400 million board feet per year that come off of this forest. This forest, and even with that, the 10-year average of harvest, still only approximately half of the annual growth has been approximately 248, I think, somewhere around there, million board feet per year for the last 10 years. The business case, to remind you, back years ago for getting the HCP was called for approximately 250 million board feet, and that was going to be the likely landing spot. And the modeling that ODF produced showed a potential harvest, the recent modeling level somewhere around 240, if I remember correctly. I'm really not certain what rationale there is between around 215, and that's part of the reason why I'm here today is to hear what that rationale is and understand a little bit more. And hopefully we will all walk out of this meeting with a little bit better understanding of that. But lastly, I just want to remind everyone what has brought us to this point, and that is the HCP that was adopted. When the HCP was adopted, in the casting of that vote, over half of the forests were placed in some level of reserve. This created, and I'm on record testifying to this, an imbalance in the greatest permanent value. It was an imbalance that was done on purpose to have those lands be solely, or mostly 90%, whatever percentage you want to put toward it, dedicated to conservation. And what that was, the idea was what was left, there would be sort of an equal imbalance, if you will, on those acres towards production to try to continue to prop up the greatest permanent value, three-legged stool, if you will. Right now, we are a lopsided stool with one leg much larger than the others. And in order to make that back, then these lands that are remaining really have to be dedicated primarily for those other values. There's also a habitat that comes along with those, and that's great. And I think that should be calculated. It should be taken into account. But the focus needs to be on the harvest levels are coming out of those, with a clear reminder that the rest of those acres are dedicated for conservation. So. That's the crux to my testimony. I just wanted to set the stage for that, and I'm eager to hear how the conversation ensues today. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate your comments this morning. I
Madam
believe
Chair.
that was our only public comment today. Is that correct?
Potentially, yeah. We did not receive any written comments, and if there's any online participants who'd like to submit or to testify, excuse me, go ahead and use the raise hand feature, and we'll get you in to provide comment.
Okay, not hearing any further public comments. Do we have, comments from me? No, we already did mine. So comments from the Board of Forestry Chair. I don't know if Chair Kelly is with us today. I didn't see him in the panelist list here. Nope. Okay. How about State Forester Skinner? Is she with us today? Interim State Forester.
So no State Forester Skinner today, but you have interim Deputy State Forester Tim Holzbach. Looking forward to the conversation today as we get the review process started here.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right, with that, I will move us quickly forward. We lost a little bit of time getting started with our technology, so we want to make sure we have time for to really see all the modeling and having some robust conversation. So I will turn it over to ODF staff to present the modeling for us and their recommendations.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Scar, Vice Chair Magruder, and Commissioners. Again, for the record, I'm Michael Wilson, and I serve as the State Forest Division Chief. We're here today to present some additional analysis that stems from last June's board of Forestry meeting, where you all discussed model outcomes with the Board of Forestry. So I'd like to start with a little background on how we got to today's work. As we all know, I think in order to implement the Western Oregon State Forest Habitat Conservation Plan, it's necessary to develop a new forest management plan for the forest that ODF manages in Western Oregon. And last June, staff presented a number of scenarios to the Board of Forestry and the Forest Trust Land Advisory Committee that described a range of potential outcomes under the draft Western Oregon State Forest Management Plan and Habitat Conservation Plan. Commissioners and board members discussed various trade-offs associated with that and some desired outcomes. And so staff conducted additional modeling and analysis to further refine some outcomes centered on providing a deliberate stepwise departure that would provide some certainty and allow both the counties and ODF to adjust to declining timber harvest volumes and revenue over time. On November 18th, staff will be asking the board to designate targets for a few select performance measures that are based on these modeled outcomes. And those performance measures will serve to guide staff in the development of initial implementation plans for the still draft forest management plan. It is necessary to get this direction now so that staff can finalize an implementation plan for the fiscal year 2028 by July 1 of 2027. So I will now turn it over to Todd to present the results of the analysis that we've done.
Thank you, Mike. Mr. Scar, members of the FTLIC. My name is Todd. Again, my name is Todd Heron. I'm the State Forest Information Unit Manager. And so I'm here today to walk through some of the results of the recent modeling and discuss some of those key outcomes. Excuse me. So I'll start with a brief overview of what we presented in June. Just a quick review, and then I'll introduce the current work and then follow that up with a brief presentation about some of the key performance measures that we're proposing. The recall back in June. Oh, and if there's a number of slides here with technical details, so if anytime you want me to stop, please speak up. So recall in June, we presented the results of some modeling that addressed four different management scenarios. Each of those included 2 or 3 variations or runs. And these scenarios were designed to demonstrate outcomes for a range of differing management priorities, while simultaneously achieving the conservation commitments laid out in the draft HCP. So these scenarios included one, what we called the 30-year certain harvest from Board of Forestry land. These runs were intended to demonstrate 3 even flow harvest levels over the course of a 30-year time frame, followed by non-declining harvest for the remainder of the modeling horizon. The second set of scenarios, or the second scenario, was to demonstrate outcomes related to trying to balance age classes over time, achieving longer rotations over the course of the HCP term. The 2 longer rotation targets were 120 and 150 years. The third scenario was what we called the max volume. These runs were designed to essentially maximize harvest over the long run, allowing whereby the model achieves this target by seeking to harvest stands at or near culmination of mean annual increment. The 2 variations, there were a couple of variations in this. One allowed the model to fluctuate unrestrained period to period, and then another one that limited the periodic harvest variation by 10%. And then finally, we had what's termed a maximize net present value scenario. And these runs were designed to essentially maximize the discounted cash flows associated with harvest over time. And again, there were 3 scenarios, excuse me. One that did not constrain the periodic harvest over time, and then a 10% limit and a 30% limit on the periodic harvest variation. And this all used a 4% discount rate. A key feature of this modeling work was that all the scenarios included identical management for the HCAs for the first 30 years of the HCP term. Okay, moving on. So part of the presentation from June included a discussion between the board, FTLIC, and division staff. And from that discussion, we had some key takeaways that we used to prepare the work for being presented today. Some of the key takeaway, excuse me, included that one, harvest flow volume should be allowed to depart from even flow. This would be a key change from how the division traditionally approaches setting harvest targets, where the expectation is that harvest will be stable over the long run with minimal fluctuations. And so these new scenarios were designed to allow for more deviation over time. Secondly, county planning from Board of Forestry harvest levels, business investments by mills and operators, and shifts in the division workforce could require could benefit from persistence of harvest levels beyond the 5-year modeling period. And then recognizing that it's important for the division to meet its targets, there And of course, there are questions related to the modeled volumes from the scenarios and what is strictly attainable given the division's current capacity and uncertainty in the data. And then finally, harvesting at older and younger ages than current management carries different opportunities and risks. In the current approach, the division pursues non-declining even flow of timber volume, where the final harvest is around culmination of mean annual increment. So diverging from this approach could change the forest structure, including habitat elements for wildlife, recreation preferences, wildfire risk, carbon, and then decision space for future management options. So with all that in mind, we proceeded to design this fifth scenario to demonstrate the likely outcomes resulting from departures from even flow, to provide increased near-term harvest and revenue, and to address the current uneven stand age distributions over time. A core feature of this new scenario is that harvest levels are held constant in 10-year time steps, similar in the duration to our implementation plans. And then these harvest levels would then gradually decline over a 30-year time frame. Excuse me. 2 model runs were tested with different starting harvest levels, one at 215 million board feet annually, and a second one at 230 million board feet annually on Board of Forestry and Common School lands combined. After the 30-year departure step period, the models were allowed to vary over time with the goal of maximizing total harvest while still maintaining a designated harvest floor of 185 million, excuse me, 185 million board feet annually for the 70-year HCP permit term. The intent of this scenario is to demonstrate high near-term harvest and revenue that the division can feasibly deliver, given the uncertainty in adapting policy level models to implementation plans. So while modeling scenarios with an unconstrained variation did indicate higher volume over time, setting the 10-year time steps allows for, along with the low end to harvest levels, allows for aids in planning future investments and provides some certainty about midterm harvest, and preserves flexibility and options for the next generation. All right, so moving on to some of the outcomes of this work. I'm going to present a series of slides relating to some of these key metrics. Harvest flow. Let's see. Yep. So as we go through the results, you'll notice that the relative differences among the scenarios typically have the same ranking. So scenario 5 is generally in between what we called scenario 3 and scenario 3 being the maximized harvest scenario, and scenario 1 being the 30-year even flow scenarios. Starting with harvest flow, this series of charts shows the estimate of annual harvest volume over time. All charts begin at year 2025, which is the first year represented by the model data. This graph shows the full 150-year time frame for the model, and then each box shows the results for the 2 or 3 runs associated with each scenario. So you can see how scenario 5 kind of compares to the other 4 scenarios. We'll zoom in on those slides a little bit in the next those panels in the next couple slides. So this first zoomed in slide, if you will, shows the Board of Forestry harvest only associated with those targeted harvest levels. And so you can see, and so importantly, we're only showing 3 runs from the past work that sort of bracket the current scenario for comparison. So the new, let's see, yeah, the time frame is still 150 years, but the y-axis is zoomed in, so you can see the differentiation among those runs. So generally, the new scenario again starts out more or less in the middle between the 30-year even flow target and the max volume target or run, but the key difference being that the floor is again set to 185 million board feet during the HCP term to allow for a more predictable or stable harvest levels over time. Again, this is the same slide, but zoomed in to the 70-year time frame for the HCP term. Move on. Okay, so moving on to revenue. This slide shows the revenue distributed to counties from Board of Forestry harvests over the 70-year time frame. And in general, it's a similar pattern to harvest volume because log values and costs, except that log values and costs are a little bit different over time, and so there's a little bit more variation in the revenue relative to the harvest levels. One feature to note: the lower harvest level or the lower revenue, excuse me, in the first time period is likely an artifact simply of the thinning that's represented in the model. There's a significant amount of thinning in this model scenario in the first time period, which is largely an artifact of the limitations in our yield table prescriptions that we had available for this work. In reality, that large amount of thinning from that first time period would be spread out over the first IP or multiple IPs. Let's see. And so this is effectively the same as the previous slide, but demonstrates the revenue distributed or retained for the Forest Development Fund. Right. Moving on a little bit, stand age or the age of regeneration harvest. In the June work, it was an important metric in that with the scenarios that targeted both the longer rotations as well as the maximized net present value, there was a significant there were significant differences in the age of harvest for those runs. However, with these runs, the age of harvest is mostly similar. Notably, the difference in the 30-year even flow scenario 1 harvested a lot of some more generally younger stands in the first 20 to 30 years. And that's simply a feature of the even flow constraint. Again, to break down the age of harvest a little bit. This graph shows the distribution of stand ages that are harvested over the first 10 years and then the second decade. The colors representing the three different model runs that are displayed in the legend. So again, you can see that the generally there are similar trends. However, similar to the average age, there are with the even flow scenario, there's more younger stands being harvested early on, as represented by the orange bars. So next, a metric of interest to track is operable inventory. So this is the essentially the Scribner volume that would be available for harvest off of the general ground as over time. Yeah, let's see. So we wanted to demonstrate the effects of harvest relative to inventory. And so again, the blue scenario being the blue lines being the current scenario that we're presenting. Again, and zoomed in over the 70-year HCP permit term. And so interesting to note is that the current scenario 5, carries a similar level of inventory to the even flow scenario, but towards the end of the permit term and then out beyond, it does a better job of maintaining a stable inventory over time. Again, reflecting that the more regulated, evenly distributed age class distribution that it achieves over time. And then, as you can see, the maximize total volume scenario reduces the operable inventory considerably over the first 20 years. Okay. So a related metric, however, this slide includes the HCAs as well, I believe. Excuse me. So here we're showing the change in carbon. Justin jumped ahead on me. Yeah, so this slide is showing the change in above ground carbon across the landscape over the 70-year permit term. Again, all scenarios are fairly similar, and like the inventory slide, the max harvest scenario shows a slightly lower level of carbon over time in the first 40 to 50 years. The dip in the first time period again is related to the high level of thinning that was represented in the model, but again we expect that would be smoothed out over time during implementation. The next slide just includes the effects of tracking harvested wood products over time without accounting for the effects of leakage, substitution, and energy capture. So this is simply the carbon that's accumulated in the forest above ground, as well as the carbon associated with harvested wood products over time. Let's see. All right, so moving on to a couple interesting habitat metrics. So most of what we call our habitat suitability indices are similar for the other terrestrial species that we have these prepared for. So in this case, we're just showing the effects relative to spotted owl habitat suitability. And notably, all of the all of the scenarios are very similar in that they increase. So on the general stewardship areas, habitat increases a little bit and then generally plateaus over time. And demonstrating that the lion's share of the habitat improvement is coming from the HCA portion of the landscape over time. So now moving on to performance measures. I'll do my best to charge through these, Mike, but I might need some assistance. So, so in the staff report, there's a set of, let's back up here. So performance measures are a select set of metrics that the board will use to evaluate management commitments and outcomes given the objectives in the FMP. The performance measures have individual component metrics that will be monitored and reported for the board and others to track management commitments and outcomes readily across the broad range of ecosystem services provided by this state forest. We'll be asking the board to set targets for a few of the more impactful performance measures at the meeting. Targets designated by the board for performance measure components are intended to be informative as a set, as increasing or decreasing one resource target will have trade-offs for others. Metrics will be measured and reported at different timescales depending on the resource. So the best time to consider them as a set for adaptive management purposes would be in the lead up to implementation plan revisions when we set the next 10-year set of objectives. So some of the key performance measures that were, let's see. So the first performance measure would be related to harvest levels. Excuse me. And in this case, setting a decadal harvest target. So in the staff report, alternative 1 calls for a total harvest over a 10-year period of 215 billion board feet, plus or minus 5%, and which is represented by the shaded area on this graph. So the dark blue line is the 215 initial, excuse me, the scenario representing that initial harvest level for alternative 1, and then the gray shaded area would be the range represented for the performance measure purpose. And then the next couple slides simply illustrate the ranges in the other two alternatives. Again, targeting those first alternative 3 sets more of a ceiling at 230 million board feet across Board of Forestry and Common School. And then scenario 2 is effectively a hybrid between or alternative 2, excuse me, effectively a hybrid between those two scenarios, those two alternatives. And again, this slide simply shows the overlap among all those scenarios for that first 10-year time period. Another key performance measure would be related to forest inventory. And so here we're showing the effect of the proposed ranges relative to that inventory over time for the first 10 years, as represented by the gray wedge. So depending on the eventual harvest levels in implementation, we expect the inventory to be either slightly higher or slightly lower than the projected dark blue line. And then finally, similar for carbon outcomes, demonstrating the range of expected carbon, above ground carbon. In this case, it's the sequestration related to above ground carbon. So the amount of carbon that's sequestered or stored on an annual basis over the first 10 years. So again, demonstrating the range of likely outcomes relative to the three alternatives in the staff report. So I think that's it for me. If there's any questions, oh, this one, excuse me, missed one here. Yeah, okay. So the final performance measure that we have on the list is related to adaptive capacity. And so adaptive capacity, what we're proposing as a key metric related to adaptive capacity is monitoring the growth of the forests over time. So how fast the trees are growing relative to harvest, and so this slide is demonstrating the growth rate as it has been measured, as it was measured from our FIA plots over the past number of years that we have records for, so back to 2017. And so for monitoring purposes, we would continue to measure these plots and over time be able to demonstrate whether or not the growth rate on the forest is increasing or decreasing relative to that performance measure target. And with that, I think I might hand it back to Mike.
All right, thanks, Todd. So, these scenario outcomes, they're not going to be exactly the same as what shows up in an implementation plan. We all know that, I think. Those actual implementation plans, are going to carry with them updated data on inventory and constraints. And these would be more of your site-specific constraints, landslide areas, and cultural resource protection or that type of thing. The big rocks are all there. So this is the third round of forest management plan scenario modeling, and we've used the same input data. It's consistent across all those scenarios as we evaluate them, but there will be updates to them. The drawback being that, there's growth, disturbance, other things they're not in there. We know that things will change a little bit. One of the things that I would say in going through these results is, so in a relative sense, they're very comparable. And then I think, they're relatively accurate in terms of, we'll talk about the limitations in a minute, I think, of what we can achieve and what maybe we would be really pushing the envelope on. So through fiscal year 26, there've been 36,000 or so acres of regeneration harvest and 9,600 acres of partial cut harvests. So that is 6% and 2% of the total forest management plan area that are not included in the modeling based on the 2021 inventory. But feedback on the modeling approach, there will lead to adjustments in the pace and scale of harvest to better reflect management on the ground for the implementation plans. And one of the things, as Todd mentioned earlier, that the forest management plan scenarios currently thin very aggressively in the first model period, the first 5 years, especially within the HCAs. We know that we will have to meet that out over that first 30 years more. However, we have also taken a look at it, and there is inventory to make up for that outside of the HCAs. So it's not just like the thinning goes down, the volume goes down. We can harvest more outside of the HCAs and fill those buckets. So that's not a particular problem. It's just that we'll have to space it out more. Also, geographically, where the model chooses to put a lot of the thinnings and HCAs aren't necessarily, or I should say, the habitat enhancements, which are thinnings and variable retention harvests and so forth, will be different. Currently, the model does a lot of that in Forest Grove, and we actually are, planning more in terms of putting a lot of it in our Astoria district. There will be some in Forest Grove, some in Tillamook. Tillamook will mostly focus on the alder and Swiss needlecast regeneration harvests needed to reset some of those stands. So the state forester will provide the additional direction on implementation, such as accounting for the district capacity that isn't included in the presented FMP scenarios, although I will speak to some of that in a moment. So the FMP scenarios are modeled at a georegion scale. The North Coast and what we call the Willamette Valley districts there, which is the St. Anne State Forest, West Oregon District, and Western Lane District. And the pace of the treatment, so the division, speaking to FTE a little bit, and those overall staffing levels. So the division has averaged 1.1 million board feet per FTE over the last 10 years. And that time period includes reductions in budgeted FTE, vacancies that we're holding, that's kind of all wrapped up in that. As the planned timber, because the planned timber harvest dropped, and so we reduced, realized some vacancy savings, didn't rehire. We still have those positions; they're just frozen, and we can open them up at any time to refill them. But I think one thing to mention is FTE and volume is a fairly easy calculation to do, but then it really depends on the type of prescriptions that we're implementing as to how much person hours it takes to lay them out and so forth. So there's still some fuzziness in there as well. But as a gross metric, that's kind of what we can use. So next slide. So we do have the staff, the staff recommends that the board adopt performance measure targets as described in, one of these three alternatives. We do have alternative one that we feel like provides us with some flexibility to work in that. But just to go over them here briefly. So there's the first one would start with a 2.15 billion board feet on Board of Forestry and CSL Common School Forest lands. So that's a target and a plus or minus 5%. So that gives you a range of 2.04 to 2.26 billion board feet over the decade. Leaves the operable inventory at 6.26 to 6.5 billion board feet. Sequesters anywhere from 0.7 to 1.2 million metric tons in above ground carbon. And the adaptive capacity performance measure, which is really about the growth of trees, is either stable or increasing. And then you can see from the next two here, we have an alternative that is set on a floor of 2.05 billion board feet on Board of Forestry lands specifically with no designated ceiling, which would result in, pretty similar inventory metrics. At the high end of that, if we consider that could go up above what alternative one would, it could result in a slightly lower, very slightly lower operable inventory out there in time, with a little bit less, obviously coincident with that, less sequestration. The adaptive capacity doesn't change at all. And then alternative three would be setting a target on 2.3 billion board feet on Board of Forestry and Common School Forest lands over the next 10 years. And so that would, if we looked at achieving that specifically, that would result in that 6.24 billion board feet again in an operable inventory and the 0.6 million metric tons of carbon and above ground trees. So one of the things that we want to do in this is, so obviously we want the board to find what they feel reflects the appropriate initial implementation of the plan, and those are going to be based, on these whatever they said as performance measures that will allow for predictable outputs and that planned timber volume. And the other co-benefits that come from that over the first 3 decades, based on the modeling here, what they can see for the first 3 decades is the fallout from pursuing one of these for the first 10. So one of the things that we did here that we didn't talk a whole lot about yet, but we did set a floor of 185 in the near term out there beyond 30 years during the HCP period. And that is so that there is some decision space left there. One of the things that we didn't hear is really a takeaway from June was, we talked about the pluses and minuses of harvesting more now, but we certainly didn't hear that anybody wanted to have little decision space at the end, right? That there wasn't enough operable inventory to really make decisions after that. And we don't want to put anybody, either counties or ourselves, in the position of all of a sudden being in a fiscal cliff at that point either. So that's one the reason that we chose that. As we look at this, we really there's not a lot of range here, right? I mean, we're looking at a pretty narrow space. And honestly, I think the board can choose to go with any of them, and we can try and achieve them. I will say this, with the range that we have in alternative 1, it gives us some room to staff up again, get that work going. I would personally want to push towards the higher end of that range, the plus 5%, not the negative 5%, because I still think it puts us in a range where we're meeting a lot of other objectives that the board is clearly interested in, up to them to decide. The minimum 205 with no designated ceiling, it kind of puts us in a similar space. One of the things that we have as a recommendation there too, to push on that a little bit, is to push on the really just recognize the reality of budgets, is that we would try to get the Forest Development Fund back up to a 6 to 12 month operating balance, which is historically what we've tried to achieve. And that lets us really ensures that we're able to implement the plan better. It's something where we're not right now, for sure. And it also, ebbs and flows with actual harvest patterns during our contract periods, and of course, timber prices and all of those things. But there is no particular ceiling on that. And so then the other performance measures that the board would adopt wherever they wanted to be in there would set the limiter on that, right? They would be the competing performance measure against that. So if the board were to say, take alternative 2 here, as it is written, we could harvest higher. We would eventually run into, are we going to go below our operable inventory, or are we going to go have less carbon sequestered than we desire, or that's set here? Then those would become the limiters. So 0.06 and 6.24 there in those 2 boxes. And then the 230, that's a little bit more on the nose there. There's not a range that we're really looking at. However, I do think the more that we push on that, the bigger chance there is that we're not able to actually achieve that particular harvest level. In terms of our planned level. And so I would like to dial back a little bit and remember that what we've been working under prior to these revised IPs that we've been working under, we were at about 225 or so. And so it's like, are we going to be able to do more than that? Maybe not. I really can't say for sure. I know that, we haven't added any position authority to our budget. So we could staff up based on the vacancies that we have and, likely achieve I think that 2.26 that you're saying there, not that different than what we were doing. Would we need any more to get that little extra? That's hard to say. It could also push us into some areas where we have less valuable timber, and that's true also with the upper end of the range there with Alt One. That just kind of is what it is. There's good reasons to harvest those stands anyway, if we're getting into those areas where stands aren't very productive and aren't giving us the best value, we need to replace them anyhow. But anyway, that's kind of I just wanted to give a little bit of framing around that. Okay. So after the board meeting, basically what we'll do is we'll continue to work on additional performance measures to reflect outcomes that are not discernible from the modeling directly. And then we'll return to the board then in June 2026 to present the final draft FMP, including summarized public comments and recommendations to plan revisions that reflect the comments received, and the board will make a decision on plan adoption. And we start modeling for the implementation plans that we would intend to be effective fiscal year 2028 or July 1, 2027 to accompany the draft FMP. So anyway, so this board meeting will give us the understanding that we need to start planning for that implementation plan development. Let us know where we sit in that. I think there's also an advantage that since the FMP is currently out for public comment, and it is a very broad and high level document, right? In order to provide the decision space to make changes over time, I think that it'll give folks commenting on the plan some idea of what it will look like, at least in its initial implementation, which may help them with their comments, because I think it's difficult. It's legitimately difficult to comment on something that's so high level. And, quite frankly, you read it and it feels good for everybody. But if you don't know what the outcomes are going to be over the near term, then it can be a little bit more difficult to understand.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, I would just like to thank you and your staff for all the work that you've done in the modeling. And I really appreciate the fact that that Mike Buffo's been able to be in that room and at the table. And so that the voices that you're hearing today from FTLAC, it's not the first time, right? We've been at the table. We have some understanding of how we've gotten here. And hopefully it means the questions that we ask of you today will get at the right spaces, right? Because we're not hearing all of this for the first time. We're not seeing it for the first time. Our experts not seeing it for the first time. So I think that'll help us generate hopefully some good conversation in the 50 minutes we have remaining. So with that in mind, we did do a little bit of pre-work to kind of get ourselves organized, also to generate that good conversation. And so I'm going to start off by handing it off to Brandon, who's going to kick us off with some.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mike, it is my understanding that these performance measures that you have laid out in the staff report, the harvest volume, operable inventory, carbon sequestration, adaptive capacity, those are not being put in the FMP, they're not being put in rule, and they're not being put in statute, right?
That is correct.
So I guess my question, just overarching at the top here, would be if these are not being put in those then how do these hold the department accountable?
So it's really through the board's statutory authority, right, to supervise management of the lands. And so, the state forester and staff need to be responsive to those performance measures and need to try to fulfill them. That's really how our feet are held to the fire, if you will.
Okay, follow up, Madam Chair. All right. So in the context then of that forest management planning, there is a forest management planning rule, OAR 629-035-0030, which says that the board shall review and may revise the forest management plan developed by the state forester to ensure that it is consistent with the OAR 629-035-0020, which is greatest permanent value. So I guess my follow-up question would be, is the failure to achieve one of these performance measures that's laid out a failure to provide that greatest permanent value?
That's a really good question. I think it is a matter of degree, actually, at the end of the day. So I think we all know the logic here behind not having the performance measures set with the plan and rule is so that you don't have to go through a rulemaking process to do some adaptive management and change some of those targets. The degree to which something is underperforming in one of those performance measures, then I think the board could revise at any time. I think also the boards, because we're talking about multiple boards at this point, right? We're going to see a lot of turnover. And I think the board also may want to adjust some of these performance measures in a way that still meets the basic GPV concept of the board, right? GPV is a little bit malleable in that sense over time. I mean, we've seen that for sure. So I think with the board finding that it meets GPV, and if they're setting of certain performance measures to do that is coincidental with that. I don't want to confuse it though with the plan meeting GPV and the plan's capability of meeting GPV. There's a nuance there where it's kind of like, okay, this plan contains all the goals and strategies that we think are sufficient to be able to meet GPV. And then we have these performance measures that are guiding us in terms of like, this is GPV. This is how we want to see it implemented.
Brandon, did that clarify what you're hoping for?
I will yield to other folks. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay, perfect. Commissioner Magruder, I think you are up next.
Well, that kind of leads us to the questions of certainty. And the report states that a reason for considering first decade harvest levels around 230 million board feet and 215 million board feet was to provide certainty about midterm harvest and other co-benefits, with midterm harvest referring to harvest more than 30 years from now. So what certainty do we have that these or other harvest level will be attained 30 years from now? I will not be here to note it, to experience it.
Margaret won't be here
I
holding your
am
feet.
counting on you telling me now.
If my family history is any indicator, I won't be either. But so I would characterize this as being something that is fairly certain. One thing that's not baked into this stuff is disturbances, perhaps reduced growth rate due to climate change, all kinds of things. And those are the kind of things that would require some adaptive management over the course of the plan, right? Let's say we have a massive fire. Well, we are going to go in and we are going to recover economic value. That's going to result in a bubble at that point, but then the future becomes a little less certain. I mean, we've seen that on the Santiam State Forest, right? We did go in, we salvaged quite a bit off of that forest. But then when you reset that and you look at the inventory going forward, you've got a bunch of stuff that is then missing. So anytime that things like that happen, we have to do some resetting and we have to reevaluate the board will have to reevaluate those performance measures. Because it doesn't do the board any good to stick with a performance measure that can't be attained because something happened. Now, in terms of the certainty associated just with the management, there's always the political uncertainty of what's going to happen, sort of the whatever the values are that go along with that. But I'm actually less concerned about that. I think, there's a certain space here that we have to walk through where, our budget is difficult, right? We all know this for sure, but we have to do what we can to maintain our operations as well. So I think there's some just real facts of life there that keep us in a certain space. And I feel pretty good about the certainty of achieving the near term.
Thank you. That's very positive. So you've outlined those several changes that may occur between now and the development of a 10-year implementation plan, including updating the inventory for recent activities and additional constraints and calibrating the pace of thinning. So given these changes, what certainty do we have that ODF will meet any of these performance measures?
So I think we're pretty certain that we can meet those performance measures. I do believe that that is one thing to think about as we push toward the higher end of harvest. If we're looking at if the board wanted to see 2.3 billion board feet harvested over the decade, I think we'd have to say, okay, but we have a lot of, and we'll come back with an implementation plan. They don't have approval of it, but they're going to have eyes on it. And if there's something in the implementation plan where it's like, well, hey, we don't think we can meet this, then that's a point to communicate with the board. And it may change some of the other things that we think about. For instance, if harvest is generally still very important to them, then we would have to say, okay, let's look at the other performance measures that fall out from that. And if we still want to try and attain a certain harvest level, given because, oh gosh, we have more depletion than we thought and less growth than we thought or something to make up for it, then we have to consider, okay, maybe our operable inventory at the end of that 10 years is lower than we thought. And then what are the ramifications for that for the future, right? So, I mean, I realize that might not be a terribly satisfying answer, but there is an adaptive management piece in there where they have to adaptively manage their performance measures to make sure that if they want X, that Y is also attainable.
Thank you. Any follow-up on that? No, okay, we're good. All right. Commissioner Banks, question?
Wow, that was really loud. Our budget processes are tuned to the unpredictability of timber monies, and we just wish to maximize revenues under the new FMP. In essence, embrace a departure. To that note, the report states that the state forester will provide additional direction on implementation, such as accounting for district capacity. That is not included in the FMP scenarios that are modeled. Your FMP scenarios are all geo-region. So then it goes to note that district level considerations may impact those overall harvest levels, potentially lowering this number. So FTLAC previously advocated to retain district level harvest flow constraints. ODF chose geo-region instead because it was easier to model and it results in a higher harvest level. So now, why are we going back to district level? And then to follow that, what new information has ODF discovered about regional capacity that they didn't have before?
Good questions. So I don't think there's anything that we've discovered per se. I think so. What we're trying to speak to here is how we would manage sort of the ebb and flow of capacity over a georegion. So let's take the North Coast as the example. How do we deal with this over Astoria, Tillamook, and Forest Grove? Currently, we're holding vacancies on all of those districts. So if harvest were to shift or the work were to shift primarily, say, to Tillamook, then we probably would not fill a vacancy or two in Astoria and instead fill them in Tillamook. And maybe use vacancies that are currently associated with the Astoria district on our org charts and fill them in Tillamook. But we also have the flow to work concept that we've had ever since we did our reorganization in 2019. And I mean, currently, even Astoria district picks up some work in northern Tillamook. Forest Grove bleeds over and gets some of the stuff on east side of Tillamook as well. And so we would continue to use that where it's feasible, but then where we choose to fill the vacancies as we go forward will be informed by the implementation plan and where we expect the harvest to occur.
So how much reduction from these models can we expect when the department models district level?
Overall, I don't think that there will be a reduction. What there will be is a shift. And I think maybe some of the most notable shifts will be around where the HCA management, where the model chose to do that versus where we will more likely be implementing it. For instance, like I think I mentioned earlier, did a lot of the HCA work on the Forest Grove district, and I actually see more of that going towards the Astoria district. And then yeah, Tillamook again is primarily the alder and Swiss needlecast restoration work in HCA's. I don't think that will shift much.
Thank you. Mike, I think
Thanks,
this is our next.
Thanks, Commissioner. Thinking of performance measures, I think about that as something that, ODF can control, like how is ODF performing and how would ODF change activities if they weren't being performance measures? And so I'm curious about the growth rate performance measure, because that seems like something, unlike harvest, where you have a lot of control over harvest, you don't have a lot of control over growth rates. And as I understand, growth rates are tracked off of the FIA plot. So you're kind of looking at your periodic increment over time. And you do some things that affect growth rates, like how you plant or silviculture or harvest, but other things like climate disturbance, insects, disease affect that too. So what would happen if you found a change in growth rate? How could ODF respond?
So we would have to respond to that. And so there's a difference there. I think there's the overall operable inventory, and how much we want to have there for future decision-making, to have on hand. And so that is, like I mentioned earlier, it's kind of like, well, maybe you cut into that a little bit if it's not what you expect and you change that performance measure in order to, continue to attain a certain harvest level. On actual growth rates, so it's a little bit, as you mentioned, it's exogenous, right? It's not something that we really control. But I do think that is, again, an adaptive management question. It's a little bit harder to, and one of the things we did was we really focused that on the growth rate of trees and not the growth rate of the inventory. We want to separate the operable inventory and what we have for the future planning a little bit from the growth question. They're tied together over the long term, but I think we will be addressing adaptive capacity and that growth metric on a variety of levels, some extremely operational and extremely prescriptive. However, if we were to see, as drought conditions get worse, et cetera, if we were to see that really go down, well, that's going to affect our decision space for the future anyway. And so I think we always have to keep an eye on that. And that's one of the things you look out for when you're adjusting the performance measures. Over the next 10 years, I don't think it's really a big threat. I think it's more of a longer term issue. But we're trying to adapt to it now through a variety of means. I mean, we're going to be exploring things around lower planting densities and other things that might help ameliorate drought conditions or make better use of reduce water competition and all that kind of stuff.
I think Nick's raising his hand over
I
there.
was going to say Nick has some.
Yeah, just to add to that, we can look at it at different scale. We can break that out any number of ways too, right? Elevations, any number of environmental gradients or by species. And also sort of by inside the HCAs or passive management versus active management in production areas, right? So it tells us a lot where are growth rates declining if they're declining, and thus should inform our response, right? So if we're seeing a decline in growth rates on the east slope of the Coast Range for Doug fir, that's informative, right? And that's something that's actionable.
Just thinking, sorry. Thinking about another, response to, in terms of operations, as we go forward, we'll be monitoring, the growth rates relative to site conditions, stand types. And if we over time recognize that our harvest is occurring on sites that are inconsistent with the expectations from the modeling and the planning, then we'll be able to observe that and make changes to our future operations plans.
Other questions? I'm interested to see how that plays out, though. I know we've talked, Mike, about how it is with silviculture and just that, just the nature of the metric is sort of beyond just strictly silviculture. So something I think we'll keep talking about for sure.
I think we are too. I was a little surprised that that's where we landed, and I'm like suspending disbelief and I'm actually growing to see the value there. So yeah, we need to let it play out a little bit.
Develops. Okay, great. So we're going to shift to some specific questions about the alternatives that you all presented. In alternative one, we noticed there's the statement that ODF will strive to achieve a harvest level that attains and maintains a balance of 6 to 12 months of operating expenses. Sorry, it is not in alternative one, but it's in 2 and 3. So the question for us was, why is it not in all alternatives? Because that is something that's crucial. So curious.
That is a good question. And it is something that we will strive to do in alternative one as well. That is an omission in alternative one, but it will always be there. That's part of the forest management. I mean, we really do. In the forest management plan, we have these implementation levels. And we do try to maintain operating fund where we can ensure that we're going to be implementing the plan as fully as possible. And in my conversation with the board, we'll be bringing that up as well, that is an intent also.
And so if it's an intent, I think the question really is why is it not printed in there? Because that's a fairly glaring piece, I guess, because we all know the importance of keeping the department strong, the department functioning at that level, all of those things. And so it really strikes a big question of, does one not do that? Is that why it's not in there?
There is the potential for one to not do that. There's the potential for all of them not to do that, right? I mean that's just how it is. I would say it's, yeah, a little bit of an oversight. We had already worked on that. We were looking at alternative 2 in terms of starting out at 205 and going higher. And it's kind of like, okay, so what's the higher? Why are we making the pie higher on that? And why is there a range then for it? And that would be the driver. I mean, it is an economic driver at that point because it is harvest.
Okay. So it is a con perhaps of alternative one is that at this point there is a greater uncertainty, shall we say, of achieving that 6 to 12 month.
There is. Yeah, I think the uncertainty is a little bit the same around all of them. Because you could always say a minimum of 205 and then never really get there as well. But yes, no, fair point. Absolutely.
Just a curiosity. It was like, that's a great statement. Why is it missing? So thank you. Okay, Brandon, I think you had some more follow-up.
I did. Thank you, Madam Chair. My question, Mike, really comes down to just why is alternative one the preferred alternative? The report doesn't really say why it's the preferred. The report says staff recommends the board finds the targets reflect appropriate initial implementation of the Western Oregon State FMP. So I guess that's my question is why are we preferring one over the other two?
So when I look at having to implement this, I do like having a midpoint target that centers around that 2.15 billion board feet, and also the flexibility to go higher, but then the realization also that, how high can we really go at the end of the day? We don't know how this will fare in actual implementation. So for me, having something that I feel represents a good range and also, just provides a range that I think navigates a lot of the feedback that we've gotten from the board so far as well. But that is it. That being said, any of the alternatives we can try to implement for sure. There's a little less, like I said, there's the higher the target is for harvest to initially. So if the board were to say, yeah, 2.3 billion board feet, there's going to have to be the realization that that is a target that I don't know that we're going to hit. And that is a target, quite frankly, I think that, that they might get other pushback on, but I'm not going to get into how they'll deal with that themselves, but it is a fair point.
Follow up, Madam Chair. So I guess my follow-up question really is around the forest management planning rule, 0350030, the greatest permanent value rule, the existing long-range plan rule. All of those say that it is the state forester. And so my follow-up, I guess, would be, how did the state forester, or I guess in this case, interim state forester, how did the forester determine that implementation of the FMP with these specific performance measures provide that greatest permanent value?
So, and that is really more about what we believe we can implement.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm-
because the,
I'm not trying to put you in the hot seat, Mike. It doesn't say in the report. And so that's why I'm curious why we're focusing on these few to get to that GPV. So
yeah, well, and they don't get us all the way to GPV necessarily, right? Because there's other things that aren't produced from the modeling. Things that are outside of harvest and inventory related metrics. So there's more to it than that. But I guess more importantly, it really is, it's about what we think is achievable, and the balance of these things. And, ultimately, I think, the board will give us their thoughts on this, and we'll get more of an idea of what they think GPV is. And since they're in the driver's seat of kind of defining that. So while adoption of the plan doesn't rely on any specific metric, obviously they're providing some direction here that is a bit of their vision, the current board's vision of how that should be implemented to achieve GPV. Yeah, in terms of the actual outcomes.
Commissioner Tucker.
So looking at alternative 2, it includes a harvest floor, but no specific ceiling. Specifically, the report says there is no ceiling with this approach, so harvest will be implicitly constrained by other objectives. The alternative has a range of values for carbon and inventory volumes, so it looks like there is a ceiling. These values, though, are very similar to alternative 1. So how is alternative 2 really different than 1? It looks like it's just a restatement slightly.
So I think the values, so you are correct. The other performance measures would provide a limiter on what that harvest could be. And I believe those were set on the 2.3 billion board feet, kind of the same range there, right? You would achieve those minimums. So those would be a limiter on that. And if those are the limiters the board chooses, then that's where that would probably end up based on our projections.
To follow up though, but what about the part about how they're different? Because then it seems like they overlap then substantially.
They overlap substantially. Yes, they do. Yes. And I should point out, in all of this, that the board may not like any of these metrics and decide to make some higher or lower as they go, right? These are some alternatives. They do not have to adopt them pro forma as they are written. They're their performance measures and they're free to do it. Part of what we're doing here is providing a guidepost on, they want to know what we think we can implement. That's important to them, but they have other things that are important to them as well. And so I think that they, they're at liberty, of course, to adjust these during their deliberations.
Okay. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
Justin just reminded me that alternative 2 is Board of Forestry only as well. There's another difference there, important difference.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's talk about alternative 3 for a minute. So for alternative 3, the report states that additional harvest could result in exacerbated issues with the division's budget if the increased volume must come from low net revenue sales. But looking at the tables in A1 through A4, you have higher average revenue per million board feet under the 230 scenario than the 215 scenario in both the first 30 years and between years 31 and 70. So talk a little bit more about that if you could, please.
Yeah, and I think we should, I think I should acknowledge that that is also a factor as we get higher with any of the harvest levels. And, you know, including alternative one, where it's not specifically called out, so I acknowledge that. But as we start getting pushed into areas to find more volume, sometimes those areas are less cost effective to manage. Some of our more difficult ground, perhaps some of our ground that isn't growing trees as well as we think they are. You know, and it could run into some problems there where we end up having sales that are difficult to balance and stay revenue positive on ODF side. And we've run into that before. We actually kind of faced this challenge coming out of the Great Recession. There was the direction to go after to focus on high net revenue sales. And that didn't necessarily mean the biggest timber, although sometimes, you know, that certainly timber volume is important, but also cost factors, including how much new road building there would need to be associated with it and so forth. So whatever was going to generate the highest net revenue. And we did run into you know, pinch points on that for sure. Absolutely. So that is fair. I think higher we go in the range, the more likely it is that we'll run into those. The reason that, you know, and like I said, as we go up in those range, could be a problem for any of the alternatives. The thing with alternative 3 is calling out to recognize that, okay, now you're focusing on the high end as the target and realizing that that might be a little less because we're not able to achieve the revenue associated with that.
Is it right, just to follow up on that, that the issue is this right sort of within ODF that it gets costly to do these sales? Because the data in the report shows almost identical and actually slightly higher revenue, I think net revenue, with the higher harvest levels.
Yes, all other things being equal. Yeah. And, you know, I think it's important, you know, Todd can speak to this a little bit if he wants to, but the costing in the model and everything, you know, I mean, it's pretty good, but it's also somewhat generic, right? It doesn't speak to the intricacies of every unit that we have out there.
Yeah, I think that's right. The model, you know, does a reasonable job of estimating logging costs and some of the costs associated with transportation, but it's not complete. And we know that through operational planning, those costs and those expenses will differ at the operational level. And so, to Mike's point, the harder we push over a certain period of time, the more difficult it will be to find those more cost-effective sales to implement.
Okay, well, interesting. And I guess I find it interesting that we have 1 as the preferred alternative because it doesn't seem that it generates quite enough revenue to do what we need to do. And it seems that 3, it puts us into very uncertain ground that makes everybody nervous. And yet we've got 2 kind of in the middle of that lives with the multiple constraints that have already been placed on our forest, frankly, but allows us to use opportunity if and when that should arise. So I think it's interesting that the preferred is 1, not 2. So as FTLIC, we've done some thinking and talking and basically turned to our expert to kind of say, are there suggestions we might have that fit into that window to maybe make 2 look a little bit better and to put our thoughts into it and maybe some of our support and our shoulder strength behind it as we walk toward the board. So I believe Mike's going to go ahead and walk through that with us, but I've got just a summary if you all want to take one and pass it down to your staff.
Yeah,
It tells you a little bit more about it. So
and that's going around there. I guess I'll just essentially read through it, but this is the FTLAC proposes modifying alternative 2 to read as follows. This would be our alternative 2A. which will set a floor for the planned harvest based on the departure steps approach, targeting 95% of the volume when using the 2.15 billion board feet as the initial decadal target, and a ceiling of 2.53 billion board feet. That 2.53 billion board feet is calculated from the table on page 33 of the scenario model outcomes, and that was the sum of the first decade, or the average of the first decade. I guess it's sum of the first decade is the right word. And she's listed here. It represents the range extending from the volume that we understand is possible under current ODF staffing to the level that was modeled using the best available data under a scenario that maximizes timber harvest volume after ensuring all HCP, FMP, and forest practices commitments are achieved, and also that maintains a forest inventory that ensures long-term sustainability. The harvest volume over 10 years would be a planned harvest volume of at least 2.05 billion board feet from Board of Forestry lands with a ceiling of 2.43 billion board feet from those lands. The remaining volume would come from common school lands. And ODF would strive to achieve a harvest level that attains and maintains a fund balance of 6 to 12 months of operating expenses. The operable inventory in 10 years, the commercial inventory outside of HCAs will range from approximately 6 billion to 6.43 billion board feet compared to the current 6.3 billion board feet. That lower number comes from look at the graphs that were in the reports provided by ODF, so we'd have to check those numbers specifically. For carbon sequestration and storage over 10 years, there would be an addition of 0.1 to 1.1 million metric tons of carbon sequestered in the above ground live tree pool compared with the current stock. And for adaptive capacity, the average annual growth rates of trees will be stable or increasing compared to the current estimate available. And this modification adds a commitment from CFTLC with a commitment to state forests. CFTLC staff will collaborate with ODF to develop proposals that will increase staffing to the level required to achieve the proposed timber harvest performance measure and to secure greatest permanent value as described in OAR 269-035-0020.
Any thoughts on that?
Well, my thoughts on this are initially are thanks, actually. I appreciate the amount of thought and effort that you put in to these suggested revisions, and I'm sure they'll be in what you submit to the board. And so I look forward to being able to discuss these with the board as well.
I still think a lot, but I forget it. How many people said this to me, but what does an HCP look like that the counties can support? And if that proposal is something that you can support, then let's do it. Let's do it.
I like the sound of that. We talk a lot about, and Seth did too when he came up, we have put so much on the land already, right? To make sure that we are meeting greatest permanent value, that we are taking care of our endangered species, that we are growing the forests that we need to grow habitat-wise, et cetera, that we're maintaining recreation, all of the things, right, are there. And so, we're talking about a 10-year window, and me, frankly, I can't see 2 years from now hardly with any clarity in what's happening in our world. And I think the same will be true for all of us as we're looking into our forests. So there may not be an opportunity to go above 215 or above or reach 230. We don't know, but wouldn't we hate to have set a cap at 215 or 230 if something occurred in the next 10 years that actually allowed us to have a significantly higher harvest in that window of time that kept the department financially stable, that kept the counties financially stable and met the rest of those, right? So it feels as if we want to be thoughtful and careful about unnecessarily constraining ourselves, because I think what we have put there already sets the rest of those values out very strongly. And in no way does this suggest that we would not meet any of the other harvest value or any of the other permanent values, right? It suggests that harvest is one of those, and having the flexibility to make that work. And of course, then for us to stand alongside you all financially to say, how do we do that, right? And Brandon, I don't know if you want to say anything kind of about your thoughts if this took additional staffing, if this took some additional ramp up for the department that we know currently isn't in your budget, how do we help with that? What does that look like, right?
Oh, happy to comment there, Commissioner. I think in the last legislative session, right, counties had a seat on the Fire 35. We worked with the legislative team at the department, not only on the long-term wildfire funding bill, but also issues around unprotected lands and issues around um, what might sometimes be a hot topic, mapping with the department. And so, right, like I think we have built a strong partnership between the counties and the legislative team here at the department, where we can go into the Capitol building, and if additional revenues are needed to do that upfront staffing so we can achieve those higher levels, knowing that they will pay for themselves, right? Because the division works off of those timber harvest payments. I think we can work together to do that, and the counties are committed to making sure that GPV is occurring in the forests. So.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I think, that might be necessary for sure. I mean, if we turn for a minute to the current economy, we don't know when things are going to get better, but we know that, lumber prices aren't great. There's still not the demand that we want out there. Mills are curtailing shifts and extending holidays and so forth. We know this is going on. We're still selling timber. Our timber sales are still selling for the most part. And the couple of no bids that we've gotten recently are more around specific issues with those sales and needing to balance some stuff out. But, I'm concerned, about how long this is going to last. And, so how much revenue is actually available for the department on its own to staff up at this point, even if we were cutting more timber. Again, the Great Recession, when we look at that and we continued to push volume at a really depressed price. And so that really extended the period under which we had to deal with austerity coming out of that as well, just because those contracts go on and weren't worth as much as we would like.
Okay, thank you. Any other comments? We've got just a few minutes left here in our wrap up. Commissioner Banks, please.
So just to follow up, I think we had this conversation, Commissioner Scar and I, earlier about how much time it takes to pivot a county government. It's like trying to turn a cruise ship. It takes a lot of time, and whatever help and assistance the Department of Forestry can do to help provide us that runway or that space in order to pivot. And I appreciate the decade-long modeling. I appreciate it being a longer span of time than just the 5 years, because 5 years is just not enough. And so a long time ago, I was very against departure. I think a lot of us were very against departure, and now we're leaning into it and learning to embrace it, because over the last year, 2 years, we've worked really hard with TLT and other avenues to try to recoup funding from other sources, so that we're not recouping that funding from our own constituents, because we feel that that is unfair. And just going to note that, just looking at our idea and and hopefully seeing some value in it so that we can maximize the next 10 years as much as possible for our community's sake, for our social services sake, but also for the sake of your department too. I feel like at the end of the day, I experienced a lot of frustration when the small table group ideas didn't come to fruition for us. We saw that as hey, you know, maybe we'll get some assistance. We still need assistance. I think you guys do also. And so whatever we can do to maximize and get the most that we can, I think will be beneficial, because I think I've only turned my cruise ship 10% and I've got another 90 to go. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Banks. I think it just reminds us we are all in this together. We are all pivoting. The department's pivoting along with us because you are seeing the same financial challenges that we see, and the more flexibility we can give ourselves to, again, allow the HCP and the other pieces that constrain us to function as they should, but not to further constrain them. And to your point, Mike, about how you all had to push greater volume at a lower rate to survive previously, if we cap this artificially at a certain level, we can actually have you find a spot where, well, we could have and still fit under the HCP, but in the FMP, we falsely constrained. So I think it's that piece, because it requires us to trust that the HCP and other pieces that sit atop our forest really are adequate for protection. And I think that we as the department and the counties agree that we have achieved that at this point, right? We have, you in particular have done a lot of good work to get us there. Let's let it do its job. So anyway, thank you for that. I appreciate the conversation. If there are any other final closing comments today.
I would just like to say that I really appreciate, quite frankly, how far I feel we've come. Appreciate everybody in this room for coming forward with their best ideas. And it does feel like we're really in this together. And I like that very much. So thank you.
Excellent. That has certainly been our goal. I do see there's a hand up online. I realize this is not a public comment session. I actually don't have any idea who that person is, if it's a member of the public or if it's staff or otherwise. Okay, and I am not going to go ahead and add extra public comment at this time. So I apologize for that, but that's, we're going to go ahead and end where we are, which is on a fantastic note, I think. And we will definitely get the details of this into our testimony and to the board. If the department has additional comments or thoughts on that, please feel free to reach out to Mike Buffo, our expert on that. And if there's something we want to further tweaking before we do that. Okay. If there's nothing else, then for the good of the order, we can actually adjourn this meeting at 11:53. Thank you, everyone.